werewolf never crossed the fence. That was the first thing that bothered me. Not that it appeared at all, or that it stood upright in a way that didn't quite match anything I could name. It was the consistency. Every night, just after dusk, it paced the same stretch of ground along the back fence, lined 3 posts wide, no more, no less. It would move from left to right, stop at the middle post, tilt its head slightly toward the house, then turn and walk back the other way. Always the same distance, always the same pause. I watched it do this for 4 nights before I realized it wasn't wandering, it was checking something. On the 5th night, without thinking, I raised my hand. The pacing stopped immediately. The thing froze mid-step, 1 foot still lifted, head already angled toward me. There was no recoil, no startled movement. Just a sudden, absolute stillness, as if the behavior had been interrupted by new information. After a few seconds long enough that my arm started to ache from holding it up, lowered its foot, turned away from the fence, and walked back into the trees. It didn't come back the next night. I didn't understand what that meant yet. I live far enough out that people call it rural, but close enough that the road still gets traffic. There's a gas station 5 minutes away, a school bus route that cuts through in the mornings, and a handful of houses scattered along the tree line like someone dropped them and didn't bother spacing them evenly. My place backs up to a long strip of forest that runs parallel to the property line. There's a fence because the previous owner kept goats. Old wood, sun-bleached and warped, leaning inward in places, more symbolic than functional. When I moved in, the landlord mentioned wildlife. Deer, coyotes, bears passing through in the spring. He said it the way people do when they want to sound responsible without sounding alarmist. I nodded, because that's what you do. I'd grown up around woods. I knew what animals did. I knew what they didn't do. The first change I noticed had nothing to do with seeing anything. The silence came earlier than it should have. Normally, the forest settled in stages, birds tapering off, insects picking up, the wind carrying sound deeper into the trees as the light faded. One evening, that transition didn't happen. It just stopped. I stood on the back porch, listening to nothing, feeling the air press against my ears the way it does when you change elevation too quickly. That was the night I saw it for the first time. It wasn't dramatic. No glowing eyes, no charge from the tree line. I was washing dishes, looking out the kitchen window, when I noticed movement where movement shouldn't have been smooth. Too tall to be a deer, too controlled to be a bear. It walked parallel to the fence, just inside the trees, then stopped. It stayed there until dark. After that, it became routine. Every evening, just after sunset, it returned to the same stretch of fence, 3 posts. The middle one always got the pause. Sometimes it leaned forward slightly, as if testing the distance. Sometimes it tilted its head farther, angling one ear toward the house. It never touched the fence, never stepped over. It acted like the boundary mattered. I told myself it was marking territory. That explanation lasted until it started interfering at first. The interruptions were small enough that I could pretend they were coincidence. I'd step outside to take out the trash and find it already there, standing closer to the fence than usual, forcing me to hesitate. Not blocking the path, just occupying it enough that I had to decide whether to proceed. When I did, it didn't react. It just watched, head following my movement with slow precision. The deer disappeared next, not gradually, all at once. One morning there were tracks along the fence line, and the next there was nothing. The birds followed. Even the crows kept their distance, circling wide and never landing near the back of the property. The thing at the fence remained. It began adjusting its behavior. Instead of pacing immediately, it would wait, stand still at the edge of the trees until I came outside. Then it would move slowly, deliberately into its pattern, left to right, pause, right to left. It never acknowledged me directly, but it reacted to my presence every time. Once I tried ignoring it. I stayed inside with the lights off, watching through a narrow gap in the curtains. It paced anyway, stopping at the middle post and tilting its head toward the house. Even though it couldn't see me, that was the first time I thought it might be aware of more than sight. I started sleeping poorly after that, not because I was afraid it would come closer, but because of the sense that something was being timed, measured. I'd wake up in the early hours with the certainty that the night had shifted, that something outside had changed position without sound on the 7th night. It didn't pace at all. It stood at the middle post and waited. I don't know why I went outside. Curiosity, maybe? Or the pressure that builds when something unspoken keeps repeating itself. I stepped onto the porch, keeping my movements slow, careful not to signal threat or invitation. The creature didn't move. It didn't bare teeth or lower its head. It just watched, up close. I could see more detail. Coarse fur along the arms, an elongated muzzle, though the face stayed mostly in shadow. The shoulders were wrung to broad, too articulated, as if the joints allowed a range of motion meant for something that needed its hands as much as its legs. One amber eye caught the porch light and reflected it back. The other remained hidden. I stopped at the edge of the steps. The fence was only a few feet beyond that, but the space between us felt deliberate, like a margin that mattered. The werewolf, because that was the only word that fit, even then tilted its head farther, studying me the way you study someone to see if they're paying attention. I didn't speak. Neither did it. After a few seconds, it took a step backward, not retreating, repositioning. That was when the sound came. It wasn't loud, not at first. A low, uneven howl carried from deeper in the forest, rising and falling in a way that didn't match any animal I recognized. It felt placed, like a signal sent through the trees rather than a call meant to be answered. The werewolf reacted instantly. Its posture changed, shoulders hunched, weight shifting forward and then sideways, eyes scanning the tree line behind it. The pacing pattern broke entirely. It moved closer to the fence, angling itself so that it stood between me and the direction the sound had come from. It stayed that way until the howl stopped. Then it left. That's when it started doing things differently. The silence began arriving earlier, not just at dusk, but in pockets throughout the day. I'd be sitting at my desk and realize the background noise had dropped away without warning. No wind, no distant traffic, just a pressure change, subtle but unmistakable. When that happened, the werewolf would appear within minutes, always at the fence, always watching the forest instead of the house. It started blocking paths. If I tried to walk the back perimeter of the property, it would shift positions to force me to turn back, not aggressively, just enough to make the choice obvious. When I changed routines, left through the front door instead, altered my schedule, it adjusted with me, I began to feel like I was being guided. One night, I noticed scratches on the fence posts, for vertical grooves pressed deep into the wood, far higher than I could reach. Not slashes, tests, measurements taken at intervals, marking height and leverage. The werewolf never touched those marks when it paced. It stopped just short of them, as if acknowledging a boundary it hadn't set. The howling returned, closer now, sliding laterally through the trees instead of approaching directly. Each time it sounded, the werewolf would change, behave, a shorter pacing, longer pauses, more time spent standing still with its head angled toward me. Once, it didn't come at all. That night, The silence thickened until it felt heavy enough to press against my skin. I stood on the porch, listening to nothing, heart pounding, and realized I'd been unconsciously watching the fence for reassurance when the werewolf didn't appear. The absence felt worse than its presence ever had. It came back the following evening, injured. I didn't notice the limp at first. It took 2 full passes along the fence before the irregularity registered. The pacing was slower, the turns less precise. One arm stayed closer to its body. Fur darkened and clumped along the shoulder as if matted with something that hadn't fully dried. The rhythm was still there left. Pause, right. But the pauses were longer now. Waited, it didn't tilt its head toward the house that night. It kept its attention fixed on the forest. The howl came sooner than usual, not after dark, but while. There was still color in the sky, the last of the daylight thinning between the trees. It sounded closer, too, the uneven rise and fall scraping against the air instead of riding it. The sound didn't echo the way it should have. It flattened, absorbed by the forest, making it impossible to tell how far away it was, or how many voices were involved. The werewolf reacted before the sound finished forming. It stopped pacing and shifted sideways, angling its body so it stood between the fence and the tree line. Its posture lowered, not in a crouch meant to spring, but in something more compact, more contained, offensive, but not panicked. Its breathing was audible, now short, controlled bursts that fogged faintly in the cooling air. I realized then that it wasn't guarding the fence, it was guarding the space I occupied. The howl cut off mid-note, replaced by silence so complete it felt artificial, like something had pressed a hand over the forest's mouth. The werewolf stayed where it was, muscles taut, eyes scanning the shadows for movement I couldn't see. Then it moved closer, not toward me, toward the fence itself. It pressed into the narrow strip of ground between wood and trees, using the boundary as cover rather than obstacle. The house lights came on automatically as the sun dropped, and I saw its eye catch the glow again, amber flashing briefly before it turned its head away. It was hiding with me. The realization landed hard, enough to make my stomach drop. The creature wasn't seeking separation. It was seeking proximity. Whatever had injured it respected human markers more than it respected werewolves. The silence held for several long seconds. Then something shifted deeper in the forest knot. A sound, not movement, but a change in pressure, like the space itself had been adjusted to make room. The werewolf flinched, then bolted, not into the trees, but along the fence line, skirting the boundary, using the straight line of posts as guidance before disappearing around the far edge of the property. I stood there long after, listening to nothing, understanding too late that the fence hadn't protected me. It had marked me. The damage showed up the next morning, just not where I expected. Tom's barn sits about half a mile down the road, tucked against a shallow rise where the trees thin before giving way to open land. He's been there most of his life, knows the forest the way some people know neighborhoods by feel rather than map. When I drove past on my way to town, the door was hanging open. One hinge twisted so badly the wood around it had split. Inside, the concrete floor was gouged deep, enough to expose aggregate, long furrows carved at odd angles. Hay lay scattered in clumps, pressed flat in places, thrown violently in others. The air smelled wrong, sharp and metallic, layered over the familiar scent of animals and dust. Tom didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't ask why I was there, just nodded once, the same way my landlord had when I mentioned the fence months earlier. There was a fight, he said, but not here. He showed me the tracks leading away from the barn, 2 sets, overlapping and then separating as they moved toward the trees. One was uneven, the impressions dragging slightly on one side. The other was clean, confident, never breaking stride. They didn't clash, Tom said quietly. One chased, the other ran. I asked him what chased. A werewolf. He hesitated, just long enough to matter. There's a word people use, he said, but it's not a good idea to learn it. He said it anyway. Once then he told me to forget it. After that, the forest felt hollow. Not empty hollow. Like something had been removed without filling the space it left behind. The werewolf didn't return for several nights. The silence arrived early and stayed late, stretching across hours instead of moments. I found myself listening for it the way you listen, for the hum of a refrigerator when the power goes out. When it came back, it didn't pace. It stood at the middle post and waited. The injury was worse now. One leg held stiff, the movement there limited. Its fur was patchy along the flank, skin visible beneath in places where something had torn too deep to heal quickly. Still, its posture was controlled. It wasn't collapsing. It wasn't begging. When I stepped outside, it turned its head fully toward me for the first time. Both eyes were visible now. Amber and steady, the gaze holding mine without challenge or threat. There was something deliberate in the way it looked at me, a surging quality that made my skin prickle. I took a step closer to the fence. It didn't move. I stopped. It held position for several seconds longer, then did something that finally broke the pattern. It stepped backward, not retreating into the trees, just far enough to clear the fence line, to stand where the shadows thickened. Then it turned and walked away, limping but upright, disappearing into the forest without looking back. It never came back after that. The silence didn't lift. Days passed, then weeks. The birds returned cautiously, but the rhythms never quite went back to normal. Sound felt unreliable, arriving in fragments instead of layers. I slept in short bursts, waking often with the sense that something had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. I started noticing my own behavior changing. The way I paused before stepping outside, the way I scanned the tree line without thinking, eyes drawn to the middle fence post as if expecting confirmation, the way I listened for pressure instead of sound. Once, late at night, the quiet thickened suddenly, and I found myself standing still in the living room, lights off, breath shallow, waiting for what I couldn't have said. Normal people would have left. I told myself that more than once, said it out loud, even testing how it sounded in the empty house. But something held me there, a sense that leaving without understanding the rules would be worse than staying. That whatever had been happening hadn't been about danger so much as preparation. The realization crept in slowly, settling heavier each time. I replayed the nights at the fence. The werewolf hadn't been warning me. It had been checking whether I noticed the right things, the pacing, the pauses, the way silence arrived before the howl, the way proximity mattered more than strength. It had adjusted its behavior in response to mine, interrupting routines, blocking paths, forcing decisions. It hadn't been protecting me. It had been choosing. I moved months later, citing reasons that sounded reasonable enough to avoid questions, structural issues, noise complaints, anything that didn't invite follow-up. The landlord didn't argue. He nodded once, like the decision had been expected. The fear didn't leave with me. Silence does something to me now. When rooms go too quiet, when sound drops away all at once, my body reacts before my mind catches up. Muscles tense, breathing goes shallow. I find myself standing still without realizing it, waiting to see if the quiet thickens or thins. Sometimes it thins, sometimes it doesn't. I lock doors now, all of them, even internal ones. Bathroom, bedroom, closets. It's not about keeping things out. It's about orientation, knowing where boundaries exist, where pressure would change if something tested them. I check frames without thinking, my eyes drifting upward, measuring height, reach, leverage. I've never found scratches like the ones on the fence. That almost bothers me more. I think about the werewolf often, about the way it used the house as cover, about how it shows proximity over dominance when something higher in the hierarchy moved into its territory. That wasn't instinct. That was strategy. This wasn't the first replacement. I don't know how many came before. I don't know how many failed. What I do know is that the werewolf didn't choose randomly. It chose someone who noticed silence, someone who learned when to stay still, someone who didn't leave. I tried to convince myself that distance mattered. The city helped at first. There's enough noise here to blunt the edges of silent sirens overlapping traffic, voices leaking through walls, the constant low hum of machinery doing something, somewhere. True quiet is rare, and when it does appear, it's usually brief, quickly overwritten by something else. For a while, that felt like safety. Then I started noticing how silence hides inside noise. It doesn't announce itself the way it did out there. It slips between layers, settles into gaps you don't notice until they widen. An elevator ride when no one speaks. A hallway late at night when the HVAC cuts off between cycles. A stretch of road where traffic thins just enough that you become aware of your own breathing. When that happens, my body reacts before I can stop it. I go still, not frozen positioned, weight balanced, muscles ready without knowing what they're ready for. I listen for the change that tells me whether the quiet is just absence or something else entirely. Whether it's thinning or thickening. That distinction matters more than people realize. Most people treat silence like a lack of information, a pause waiting to be filled. They rush to break it clear their throat, check their phone, say something unnecessary just to re-establish noise. They don't like the way it presses back when there's nothing pushing against it. I understand that instinct now. Silence isn't empty, it's active. It shifts depending on what's nearby, what's moving, what's deciding whether to reveal itself. Once you recognize that, you can't unlearn it. You can't go back to treating quiet like background. That's the scar I carried with me when I left. Not fear of the werewolf, not even fear of what hunted it, fear of readiness. There was a period after I moved when nothing happened. Weeks passed without incident. Sleep came easier. The city noise did its job. I started to believe that whatever hierarchy I'd glimpsed back there was bound to that place. That territory mattered. That I'd crossed out of it cleanly. That was when I got the message. It came late at night from a number I didn't recognize. No introduction, no context. You used to live near a tree line, didn't you? I stared at the screen longer than I should have, my thumb hovering just above the keyboard. I didn't ask how they knew. I didn't deny it. Yes, I typed. The reply came almost immediately. Did it pace the fence or the house? I never told anyone about the fence. I turned the phone off and sat there in the dark, listening to the building breathe around me. Pipes clicked. Somewhere above me, someone shifted in there. Sleep. A car passed outside, its sound fading gradually instead of cutting off all at once. Normal sounds, enough of them to keep the silence from settling. The next morning, there were 3 more messages waiting. Short ones, careful ones. They didn't ask about the werewolf. They asked about timing, about when the quiet arrived, about whether I noticed that things stopped moving before anything actually showed up. I deleted them all. That was my mistake. After that, I started seeing references in places I wouldn't have noticed before. Not explicit, not obvious, just phrasing that caught my attention the way certain sounds do now. Comments under local news articles about livestock losses that didn't fit usual patterns. Forum posts about pressure zones in wooded areas. A line in a police blotter about officers feeling watched near a closed park after dark. Once you know what to look for, it's everywhere. I don't think people are seeing more of it. I think they're standing still long enough to feel it. I went back once. Not to the house. I didn't get that close. I drove the road late at night, headlights off, coasting the last stretch the way Tom used to. The place looked smaller from a distance, like it was trying to disappear into the land. No lights, no movement. The field behind it lay flat and empty, grass pressed down in subtle arcs that didn't line up with the wind. I stayed in the car. Silence settled around me, thick enough that I could hear my own pulse. For a long time, nothing happened. No shapes, no sounds. Just that suspended feeling, like the world had paused mid-breath. Then, somewhere beyond the trees, something shifted. Not a noise, not movement. A rearrangement. The sense of space adjusting itself to accommodate something that didn't want to be seen yet. I felt it the way you feel someone step into a room behind you without touching you. I didn't wait. I drove away with my hand shaking on the wheel, heart pounding so hard it blurred my vision. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew better now than to track silhouettes or search for eyes. That's how it measures you. That's how it decides what you are. What stayed with me wasn't fear of the thing itself. It was the memory of the werewolf's posture, the way it pressed close to the fence, the way it used my presence, my light, my walls as a buffer against something it couldn't fight. That wasn't instinct. That was strategy. A calculation made under pressure by something that understood the hierarchy it was trapped in. That realization changed how I hear stories about monsters. People always argue about which one is worse, which one would win. They talk about strength, speed, claws, teeth. They miss the part that matters. Apex predators don't prove themselves through violence. They prove themselves by controlling. Where violence happens, whatever was hunting that werewolf didn't need to rush. It didn't need to attack outright. It moved the world around its prey until the prey had nowhere safe left to stand. It turned houses into markers, people into cover, silence into a signal. I don't know if it followed me. I don't know if it needed to. What I do know is that the werewolf learned something before it disappeared. Something about survival that didn't involve winning. And it passed that lesson on the only way it could by seeing whether someone else could hold position long enough to understand it. This wasn't the first replacement. That thought comes back to me more often than I'd like. The idea that the role exists whether anyone wants it or not. That when something higher up the ladder applies pressure, the lower rungs adjust, shift, look for places to brace. That preparation is sometimes the only form of resistance available. I think about Tom sometimes, about the way he nodded when I mentioned the fence, like he'd been waiting for someone else to say it first. I haven't tried to contact him. I don't want to know what he's seen since, if he's still there at all. Some questions are safer unanswered, even if curiosity pulls at them. Every so often, though. I searched the area online, just enough to see if anything's changed. Properties listed and delisted quickly. Notices about road closures that never explain why. A spike in missing livestock reports that tapers off without comment. Patterns, always patterns. Once, scrolling late at night, I came across a post from someone describing scratches high up on a fence not far from where I live now. Different state, different forest, same spacing, same height. The comments were full of jokes, explanations. people eager to dismiss it as bears or machinery or vandalism. The original poster stopped replying after a while. I saved the post anyway. I've noticed that the longer I live like this, the more my sense of safety has inverted. Crowded places make me uneasy now, because of people, but because of how much noise they make. How easily true silence can hide inside it, slipping between layers unnoticed. Out in the open, in wide spaces, at least you can feel the quiet coming. Inside buildings, it arrives all at once. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the certainty that the room has changed. Not visually, spatially. Like the distance between objects has shifted just enough to matter. I lie there, eyes open, listening to the absence of sound, waiting to see if it thickens or thins. If it thins, I relax. If it thickens, I don't move. That's another habit I picked up. Stillness, holding position, letting whatever is measuring the space decide I'm not worth engaging with. I don't know if it works. I don't know if it ever did. But the werewolf tried it, and for a while it seemed to help. I've never heard the howling again. That worries me more than if I had. Silence, after all, isn't always the pause before a sound. Sometimes is the result of something no longer needing to announce itself. Sometimes it means the work is already done. I think back to the fence, to the way the werewolf marked space instead of attacking. Not threats, not warnings, tests. Measurements taken high enough to communicate something without explanation. I can reach here. I can go higher. Plan accordingly. When I lock my doors now, when I check frames and hinges and look up without thinking, I'm not trying to keep something out. I know better than that. I'm orienting myself inside a hierarchy I don't fully understand, trying to stay low enough on it that nothing has a reason to correct me. That's what the werewolf was doing. Staying close, staying quiet, hiding in the shadow of something louder, brighter, easier to notice. Using me. If I'm honest, the worst realization came much later. Long after I'd moved, long after I'd convinced myself distance meant safety. It was the thought that whatever was hunting it didn't need to follow me. It learned enough just by watching how the werewolf behaved, where it hid, what it used, what it considered safe. People assume predators learn from their prey by chasing them. That's not always how it works. Sometimes they learn by observing what fear chooses to stand next to. I don't know if silence will ever feel normal again. I doubt it. I think once you recognize it as a signal instead of a state, it changes you permanently. Makes you cautious in ways that don't translate well to everyday life. Makes you seem distant, paranoid, overly alert. That's fine. Normal people would leave a place like that and never look back. They'd chalk it up to a bad chapter, a strange coincidence, something easier to forget than confront. I tried that. It didn't stick. Because every now and then, when the world goes still in just the wrong way, I feel that same pressure I felt standing near that fence, watching something powerful choose proximity over dominance. And I understand the message it was sending. Not to me, but to whatever was listening.